If there's one family that, more than any other, is part of American legend, it is the Lee family of Virginia. That sturdy bloodline that blossomed in the New World and yielded unto us Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, both of whom were founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence. Light Horse Harry Lee, that dashing cavalier of the Revolution. Robert E. Lee, the famous Confederate general, and perhaps one of the most famous Americans of all time. This is a family that operated under the firm belief that its ancestry could be traced back to a martial legacy, one of the highest in the land of England, or at least to a Norman one that had set its roots in the country gentry from around where they, according to family legend, came, Shropshire. They thought they were descendants of the Lees of Coton, an ancient gentry branch in the British landed elite that could trace its ancestry back to a Norman named Reynard de Lega, whose name eventually transformed into Lee. According to the fullest version of this long-accepted family narrative and tale, Richard Lee I, that emigrant who arrived in Jamestown around 1639, that brave and dynasty-building man we discussed last time, was a younger son of this ancient coat of arms possessing Shropshire gentry family. But squeezed out of a substantial inheritance at home by the law of primogeniture, like so many of his Cavalier comrades in Virginia in those days, Richard had supposedly carried the family's historic coat of arms across the Atlantic to plant a noble lineage in the American wilderness. This was a legend long attested. It was verified by family Bibles. It was seemingly inscribed upon colonial tombstones, on cups. It was a legend ultimately sanctioned by the College of Heralds, the ultimate authority for these things in the British Empire, which ruled that the Lees of Virginia had the right to bear the arms of Coton. But the truth might not be so simple. It could be, in fact, that our noble Lees of Virginia had no Norman heritage at all, that they weren't part of the gentry, that they simply arrived in Virginia and claimed to be such. But then again, we don't know, and a variation of the old story might be true as well. Such is what we're going to explore in this episode of The Old World Show. Welcome back to The Old World Show with Will Tanner, the show where we tell the tales of the great colonial adventures and magnificent American and British families of the world that used to exist. Make sure to like this video, to subscribe to this channel, and to share this video around if you like it. That is how we grow, and it's how we keep this project going. So last time we told the tale of Richard Lee I, the founder of the Lee dynasty. This time, in something of a short, fun addendum to that episode, we're going to tell the tale of the Lee family ancestry and explain whether they really were a cadet branch of the Norman-descended country gentry, the Lees of Coton, as was long claimed, or if they were something else. There's a lot of conflicting research into this, and I find the subject fascinating for reasons related to the Normans, and I think you're going to like it as well. It is really quite a fun subject that gets into a good bit of English and American history in the early colonial period. So the figure on whom the alleged Norman pedigree of the Lees rests is a 12th century Norman named Reynard de Lega. In the genealogical records of Shropshire, this family name appears alternately as de Lega, de Le, or Lee, or de Lea, which, in any case, derives from the ancient manorial estates held by the family in the West Midlands of England. Around the year 1200, Reynard de Lega rose to considerable local prominence, serving as the High Sheriff of Shropshire. He was a man of the martial gentry, so they thought, a lord entitled to bear a coat of arms characterized by a fess checky between 10 billets, a distinct heraldic device that denoted military service, land tenure, and a recognized place within the feudal hierarchy of Norman England. This is the man to whom the Lees claim to be able to trace their ancestry, as put in Lee Chronicle by Casanova Gardner Lee, noting that an impostor would have been detected because the right to bear arms was so rigorously enforced. Quote, the pedigree of the English house registered at the Heralds' College is one of the oldest in England, going back to the Norman, Reynard de Lega, Sheriff of Shropshire about 1200, and the first to bear the fess and billets of the Lee arms. The surname itself, Lega, Lee, is of Saxon origin, deriving from the Ley under Pimhill, their original Shropshire estate. In the old days, no one bore arms unless he was entitled to them. Likewise, the bearing of a particular coat was indisputable proof of descent, and any impostor assuming a well-known coat would have been detected at once. end quote. The line of that Norman can thus be traced down through the centuries of Shropshire knights to the masters of Coton Hall, which, until the Victorians ruined it, was a handsome stone manor home located in the parish of Nordley Regis. More on that later, in Shropshire, from where the Lees claimed descent. Specifically, Richard Lee I was supposed to be descended from this specific Coton Hall line of Reynard de Lega's progeny. This was a key part of the identity of the Lee family and appears to have been a widely, fiercely, and strongly held belief of them. As noted by Philip Alexander Bruce in the Virginia Plutarch, Volume 1, quote, "The name ascended to the Norman conquest, and in its transfer to the colony overseas, a land that was now as the mother country was old, new as the mother country was old, it was destined to add greatly to its fame. The future patriot, Richard Henry Lee, aware of the conspicuous part which his great-grandfather, grandfather, and father had played in the history of Virginia, must even in youth have been unconsciously influenced by the tradition of the public service in which they had so prominently and so uprightly taken part." End quote. Similarly, also focusing on Richard Henry Lee and this Norman heritage, Harlow Giles Unger notes in his book First Founding Father, which is about Richard Henry Lee, that the family did believe this myth and acted on it, as shown by how Thomas Lee had been educated and had his children educated. Quote, "For almost all of his life, Thomas Lee had believed, and perpetuated, the family myth that the Lees had landed among the Norman knights at Hastings in 1066. Although his boys were fourth-generation Virginians, the Lee family's evident importance in English history made it imperative that he send them home to England for a proper education, much as his own father had sent him there, and as his father's father had sent his sons to English schools." Unger continues, end quote. So the family certainly believed the claim of descent, tracing back to this Norman and the Lees of Coton Hall. Yet further, they seem to have lived up to the reputation their knightly blood would imply. As Burton J. Hendrick observes in The Lees of Virginia, Biography of a Family, quote, "The record of the Lee family has consistently been one of leadership, integrity, and high courage since they first came to Virginia." Skipping ahead a bit, "They had from the start what someone has termed the Virginia habit of command." End quote. So for generations of Lees, that habit of command was justified in their minds by the quiet assurance that they were the sons of Coton Hall, carrying the blood of the Normans into the New World. And so the Lees believed themselves to be part of that ancient lineage. Summarizing their view of what had happened and how they came to be merchant planters in the New World rather than members of the Anglo-Norman gentry in the Old, Clifford Doughty notes in his book, The Virginia Dynasties, quote, "Richard Lee I was one of the few dynasty founders whose English line was established beyond question. He had the right to use the generic arms of the Lee of Shropshire, first borne by the Norman Reynard de Lega, or de Lega, about the year 1200. His family lived on the estate, or manor, of Nordley Regis, though when Richard Lee was born, the unpretentious house and modest holdings had passed to the older brother of Lee's father." End quote. Importantly, this legend of their Shropshire pedigree was not built on thin air. They had what seemed to be, and to many, such as myself, still does seem to be, a good bit of evidence to back them up and believing at least some variation of this tale. The most famous piece comes from Oxford University. There, in the year 1658, John Lee, the eldest son of Richard Lee I, was a student at Queen's College, Oxford. Before returning to Virginia to assume his place as a colonial magistrate, John followed an ancient university custom by presenting his college with a silver pint cup. Importantly, this cup was no just ordinary piece of tableware. It was a statement of family identity. The silver was engraved with the coat of arms of the Lees of Shropshire, the historic Festcheque and billets, and alongside this was a formal Latin inscription that was carved into the silver, which identified John Lee as the son of Richard Lee, quote, "of Morton Regis in Shropshire," end quote. Now, this initially poses a puzzle. There is no place named Morton Regis anywhere within the boundaries of Shropshire. There wasn't then. However, there was a Nordley Regis, the exact manor where the historic estate of Coton Hall was situated. So, defenders of the Lees Norman heritage argued that what had likely happened is that the Oxford silver engraver had been handed a piece of paper containing Richard Lee's notoriously difficult 17th century cursive handwriting and had simply misread the script, mistaking the letters of Nordley, both of which were used for the manor, for Morton. Noting as much in Lee Chronicle, Casanova Gardner Lee provides, quote, in 1658, Richard Lee's oldest son, John Lee, while a student at Queen's College, Oxford, gave the college a silver pint cup or tankard engraved with the generic Lee arms quartered with Astley as borne by the Coton Lees. The accompanying inscription describes the Lee family as deriving from Morton Regis, which does not exist, but this is now accepted as being John Lee's or the engraver's error for Nordley Regis, the manor of which the Lees' Coton Hall is the seat. This is the earliest record of what arms the Virginia family claimed, end quote. There's more similarly timed evidence as well. It was in the winter of 1659 that a learned young Englishman named John Gibbon arrived in the Chesapeake. Gibbon was a scholar of historical lineages, an expert in heraldry, who had later returned to London to become a distinguished member of the College of Heralds. As a fun side note, he was also the granduncle of the legendary historian Edward Gibbon, the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. In any case, Gibbon spent nearly a year living as a guest at Richard Lee's primary estate at Dividing Creek, and during his stay, he observed not only the daily operations of the plantation, but had time to immerse himself and observe Lee's extensive library and his legal papers. Decades later, in 1682, Gibbon published a landmark scholarly treatise on heraldry in London. In the pages of it, Gibbon paid a formal and public tribute to his former Virginia host. And this gets into the ancestry bit. As Lewis B. Wright notes in The First Gentleman of Virginia, quote, the first Lees, with their class consciousness, liked to think of themselves as part of the hereditary gentility of England, English country gentlemen living on their Virginia estates. Perhaps that may account for the presence in the Lee Library of James York's The Union of Honor, 1640. Skipping ahead a bit, Lee had a particular personal interest in John Gibbon's Introductio ad Latinam Blasonium, because the author had spent the year 1659 with the elder Richard Lee, and in his work had paid his host a tribute, end quote. This is relevant because in his treatise, Gibbon explicitly attested that Richard Lee I was a kinsman of the historic Lees of Shropshire and possessed an undisputed hereditary right to display their ancient coat of arms. Given his position in the College of Heralds, this was seen as, if not definitive, at least conclusive proof. And there is more as well. In 1929, a direct descendant of the Lee line inherited a historic family Bible that had been preserved for generations at the Cobb's Hall estate, which was the seat established by Richard Lee I, his youngest son, Charles Lee. This Bible had been printed in London in the year 1765, but its significance lay in its front flyleaves, which contained a series of meticulous genealogical entries that had been carefully transcribed from a much older, decaying family Bible before it was lost to time, putting the original back in the day of either the first Richard Lee or perhaps Richard Lee II, and showing the family's ancestry all the way back to Richard Lee I, which it stated he was, quote, son of Richard Lee of Nordley Regis in Shropshire, end quote. Such would, if true, appear to connect them to the Coton Hall branch and show that they knew the name of the manor and parish. They had just misstated it on the cup that was engraved. Writing about this Bible in his book First Families, author Nathaniel Burt says, quote, finally, in 1929, a family Bible turned up which had an authentic record of the parentage of Richard the Emigrant. It was Nordley Regis, not Morton, where the Lees came from. Someone had made a mistake in engraving the cup, and the mistake was copied in engraving the tombstone. Nobody cared. This pedigree, discovered in 1929, was accepted by the English College of Heralds in 1930. Richard Sr. turned out to be a younger son of a Richard Lee, in turn younger son of a John Lee of the Lees of Coton. Bona fide country gentleman with large landholdings, an Elizabethan mansion called Coton Hall, mucked up by the Victorians later, and a parish church, equally mucked up by Victorians, full of canopied Lee tombs, end quote. So, armed with this newly unearthed Bible entry, and more on the tombstone that Burton mentions in a minute, the historic 1658 Oxford Cup, and the 17th century text written by John Gibbon, the expert on such things, family researchers formally presented their case to the Royal College of Arms in London. The heralds of the college examined the accumulated evidence through the lens of traditional British pedigree law, and in November of 1930, the College of Heralds issued an official ruling. They formally accepted the pedigree, certifying that Colonel Richard Lee the Emigrant, Richard Lee I, was indeed the legitimate son of Richard Lee of the Coton Hall gentry line in Shropshire, and so bearing the ancient coat of arms, the fess chequy and billets, was officially confirmed as the birthright of the Virginia descendants. So, by decree of the king's own heralds, they were the undisputed sons of Norman knights and had this grand Norman lineage going back hundreds of years. Still, there were indications that this legend was not so true, or at least not so neat. The first crack in the armor comes from a lonely graveyard on the northern neck of Virginia. This is the tombstone mentioned earlier. In the year 1714, Colonel Richard Lee II, known to history as the Scholar, died and was buried at his Mount Pleasant estate. His family erected a handsome, heavy stone monument over his grave, and into it was carved a Latin epitaph designed to celebrate his classical learning. He was known as the Scholar, after all, along with his high political stations, such as on the Council of State in Virginia. But when historians translated the Latin text, they encountered the jarring geographical error also present on the cup. The tombstone stated that Richard II's father had been born at Merton Regis in Shropshire. Specifically, it said that the Scholar came from, quote, an ancient family of Merton Regis in Shropshire, end quote. This was not a good revelation. Well, on the cup, Morton Regis could just be dismissed as a one-time mistake made by a careless London silver engraver who had a difficult piece of cursive script to deal with. The repetition on the tombstone that was carved 56 years later in Virginia suggested that perhaps the early generations of the Virginia Lees didn't really know where they were from or where in Shropshire, if in Shropshire at all, their father had been born, and certainly not from which line they came. It would indicate, if the critics are to be believed, that they were just copying over the geographical error that had been inscribed on the Oxford Cup, or whatever had led to it being transcribed in such fashion, perhaps like making it up, and thus that they were just trying to construct this pedigree after the fact, attempting to invent a background. Now, as Nathaniel Burt notes, that's not necessarily the case. It could just be that something had gotten mixed up and that later, examining the family Bible, they discovered that and found that it was Nordley Regis. But many critics contend that the tombstone shows that it was just made up and they didn't really know where they were from and didn't have this proud sense of ancestry and tradition. It's something with which I generally disagree, as we'll get into at the end. But nevertheless, it is a point against them, and a much more serious one than the mistranslation or misinscribing on the cup. Another crack in the myth appeared in a genealogy that was compiled in the year 1771. William Lee, a great-grandson of Richard Lee I, who was then living in London as a merchant and diplomat. We'll be doing a show on him in a couple weeks. He's a fabulously interesting guy and was very important for the founding. He sat down to draft the first comprehensive written history of the Lee family of Virginia. And to reconstruct what had happened with the earliest generations, William relied heavily on a private letter that was written in 1745 by Lancelot Lee, the then contemporary master of Coton Hall in England. So by then, they had connected themselves to Coton Hall and Nordley Regis, found that out. But there were issues in the letter. Namely, Lancelot Lee was an English squire who seemed to know absolutely nothing about the American branch of the family, and so made up facts. For example, in his letter, which was used to try and prove the family's ancestry, he casually guessed that the Virginia family must have emigrated around the year 1616, and William Lee accepted the state, weaving it directly into the family narrative. Now, this is a problem, for one, because it distorted biographies that relied on it. And more importantly, it showed something along the same lines as what the tombstone showed. The family's reliance on Lancelot Lee's flawed memory seemed to indicate that their connection to Shropshire, which had no recollection of them, was born out of wishful thinking rather than actual evidence. Now, perhaps not, but it was another thing that showed that maybe this connection, going back to Coton, isn't real in the way we think it is, because the guy who owns Coton has no recollection or record of us. The back and forth then continued, even with the College of Heralds ruling. And by the early 20th century, many American historians were doubting the official narrative, regardless of what the College of Heralds said. Amongst them was Douglas Southall Freeman. He, of course, is the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of Robert E. Lee, whose 4-volume history of Robert E. Lee has entered the realm of legend. And also joining him was the distinguished historian Burton J. Hendrick, who wrote probably the best overall biography of the Lee family as a whole. In his landmark 1935 study, The Lees of Virginia, Hendrick analyzed the evidence that had been utilized by the London Herald and found it lacking in any real institutional support. As Lee wrote as Hendrick wrote, in The Lees of Virginia, quote, concerning his ancestral origin, nothing is definitely known. The simple fact is that we do not know who Richard Lee was. That is, we do not know the names of his father or mother or the place and date of his birth, end quote. Hendrick and Freeman argued that the College of Heralds had ruled on unsatisfactory evidence, heavily swayed by the eminence of the American family rather than the evidence of any records from the 17th century on which it could and should have relied to prove this. Still, it should be noted that Clifford Doughty, a protege of Freeman's, seemed to disagree with him at least somewhat on this, given the passage from the Virginia dynasties that we cited earlier and one that we'll go over later. Things thus remained up in the air for over 50 years following Hendrick's broadside at this claim of Lee family history, and the actual identity of the immigrant patriarch remained one of the more frustrating mysteries in American genealogy, at least for those very few who care about such things. There's much more going on in the 1930s than just the bickering over Lee family heritage. But in any case, the breakthrough, at least for the people who think the Norman heritage to be untrue, arrived in December of 1988 and was published quietly within the pages of the National Genealogical Society Quarterly. A meticulous, brilliant genealogist named William Thorndale did something that no other researcher had at that point thought to do. Instead of just looking at the gentry records of Shropshire, he started methodically searching through the probate files, apprentice logs, and parish registers, including for members of the working class and other classes, not just in Shropshire, but in the adjacent county of Worcestershire. Thorndale proved through an unbroken chain of wills and baptismal entries that Colonel Richard Lee was not a child of the Shropshire Knights at Coton Hall. He was born and raised in Worcester, the son of John Lee, a local clothier and clothing merchant, and his wife, Jane Hancock. Describing those families and their origins in his Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, which is a fabulous book, by the way, Kent J. McGaughty provides, quote, the marriage of John Lee and Jane Hancock, in part at least, represented a business merger of sorts. Kinship networks along these lines allowed for the economic growth of families living throughout the English countryside, and the Lee-Hancock connection proved very successful. The partnership between the Lee and Hancock families serves as an illustration of the dynamics contributing to Worcester's growth as a major economic center in the 15th and 16th centuries. After John Lee married Jane, his mill became a subsidiary of Hancock's larger factory. Their combined interests afforded them greater opportunities to purchase the cloth made by other small textile mills. Afterward, Hancock would arrange to transport the cloth to London, where it would be traded for various products around the world, including luxury cloths from Europe, velvets, silks, and other satins from the Mediterranean, wines from France and Spain, and spices from Asia. Once Hancock arranged shipment of these products from London, with the exception of the wines brought in from Bristol, they would sell them at the markets to townspeople and to families returning from the surrounding rural districts, end quote. As a fun side note, this discovery of Richard Lee I's true parentage sparked renewed interest in the de Lega connection, and that research rediscovered that that name was frequently used as a professional descriptive title meaning of the law, and was used to describe highly literate public scribes, clerks, local attorneys, men of that sort, who made their living by drafting deeds, witnessing contracts, navigating what common law early courts there were in England. And so, fascinatingly, it was in such a role for Governors Wyatt and Berkeley that led to Richard Lee I's early successes. So that's interesting. But in any case, the Hancock and Lee connection to Worcester, it shows from whom Richard Lee I came, which is this family of merchants. And it specifically shows that it was around the winter of 1639 that a 21-year-old Richard Lee used his family's extensive commercial connections in the London cloth trade to secure a position in Virginia and looking out for the family's interests there, particularly in fur, and to come over as part of the administrative circle of the incoming royal governor of Virginia, Sir Francis Wyatt. We covered all that in the episode on Richard Lee I. This leads to the matter of what we do know and what we don't. What we know for sure, or at least as much as we can know any of this for sure, is that Richard Lee the emigrant was not the son of a Shropshire knight or landed gentleman, but the son of a Worcester cloth merchant. What we do not know is how the story of the Coton connection came about or what elements of it might be true. For one, admittedly, Richard Lee I could have just made it up to appear more genteel and gain in the rankings in colonial Virginia's prestige games. Maybe that's what he did. But on the other hand, the Lees do appear to have absolutely believed that they were descended from the Lees of Coton Hall, Tombstone or not, and this was a part of the psychological foundation of the entire dynasty. Noting that a connection from farther back might be the case, but is nearly impossible to tell for sure thanks to the difficulty of finding records past a certain point, Casanova Gardner Lee notes in the Lee Chronicle, connecting all these things in an interesting way, quote, "Later research shows that John Lees, the clother, was a son of John Lees, weaver, and Alice Hart, his wife. Research to determine the parentage of John Lees, weaver, will continue, but it is clear that with each preceding generation, the search becomes more difficult as the surviving records decrease. The use by Colonel Richard Lee and his children of the Lee coat of arms continues to suggest that these people descended from the Coton Lees. Enough is known of the descendants of Humphrey Lee, who died 1588 and 89 of Coton, to make it clear that John Lees, 1563 to 1587, could not have been one of them. The Coton connection, when, if ever established, must derive from a younger brother of Humphrey Lee or a younger brother of one of Humphrey Lee's male line ancestors. It is evident that Richard Lee and his children believed they had the right to use the Lee arms," end quote. And as a side note there, the bit about the specific arms used is because there were a number of Lee families in the area and each had variations of the coat of arms. And it was always the Coton Hall branch arms that the Lee family used, which really does indicate something of a connection there. So the idea that there was a connection going back some ways that got gradually mixed up into the Merton Regis confusion and confused over time, and particularly as Richard's father was named John Lee, and had he been of the Coton Hall line, his grandfather would have been a John Lee. That makes sense. It makes sense that there was some connection there that got gradually distorted over time, but was still, in the end, at least somewhat true and did connect them. This was, after all, the era of primogeniture, which is part of the general myth of the Cavaliers and their younger sons in Virginia history. At each generation, the eldest son inherited the landed estate, and the others had to find something else to do, which typically meant trade, as was the case with the Lees. This need not have been the life Richard or even his father or grandfather was pushed into. Many merchants of their eras came from originally genteel backgrounds, and from there, their lines remained merchant lines. So it could have been a couple generations back and then descended down to Richard Lee I, but still with this memory and family mythology of the connection. As Philip Alexander Bruce notes in his Social Life of Virginia in the 17th century, quote, "Perhaps the most important section of the higher planting class during the 17th century were the families sprung directly from English merchants. Many of these descendants of English merchants, however, traced their pedigrees back, and that too, not remotely, to landed proprietors in the different shires, for in that age a very large proportion of those engaged in trade in the cities had come in from the rural parishes. The law of primogeniture, which was perhaps more deeply rooted in England in those times than in these, had, as already stated, a powerful influence in causing many of the younger sons of the landed gentry to emigrate to Virginia in search of fortune, but it had an even more powerful influence in forcing many of these younger sons into mercantile and even into mechanical pursuits in order to earn a subsistence without leaving their native country. End quote. Such could have been the case with Richard Lee I's ancestors, and would explain why the family certainly seemed to believe the tale of their genteel Norman blood, even if the specific legend passed down to them wasn't accurate. Clifford Doughty, that protege of Douglas Southall Freeman, who's now been mentioned a few times, certainly seemed to believe some variation of this to be true, as he noted in his book, The Great Plantation. Quote, among the ambitious men who succeeded in Virginia, there was no record of connection with the nobility. Richard Lee I, one of the first of the empire builders, came of a younger line which had branched off from modest landholders, and was now established in London as merchants. Dispelling all questions about his status, Lee identified himself as a, quote, merchant trading in Virginia, end that quote. John Carter, one of the greatest dynasty founders on the continent, most probably came from a family of London vintners, also a younger branch earlier uprooted from the land, end quote. Such would mean, if accurate, that Lee was descended from Reynard de Lega through the Cotton Hall branch, just not from the generation originally thought. Such would explain the seemingly Anglo-Norman temperament of the Lees, that curious mix of rootedness to the soil of ancestral estates, mixed with rakish, cavalier dash and pluck, and immense risk-taking premised on their personal capacity as excellent men, more capable than all around them, while also accounting for the genealogical evidence we know to be true. Such is what I believe. We'll never know for sure, and perhaps Richard Lee I just made it up, but it's interesting and what I think to be true. Next time, we'll be picking back up the story of the Lee dynasty with the generation that followed Richard Lee I, discussing how a family became this great line, the Lee family of Virginia. Thank you for listening. I do appreciate it. As a reminder, you liking this video, sharing it around, commenting on it does help tremendously. So I'd really appreciate you doing that if you could take a couple seconds to do so. But thank you again, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.